It was almost 7:30 p.m. when Ethan Miller pushed open the glass door of the pawn shop on the corner of Belmont Avenue. The fading light outside threw long shadows across the worn counters and dusty display cases. In his hand, he held a watch with a leather strap, rubbed smooth by decades of use. It had been his father's, and then a constant companion through birthdays, breakdowns, and long nights fixing cars at the garage. Tonight he turned it over one last time before placing it on the counter. The owner, a man with thinning hair and tired eyes, counted the bills slowly, giving Ethan every chance to change his mind. But Ethan's fingers closed around the money without hesitation. $37. Enough for a small bouquet and maybe a coffee if she wanted to split the check. The florist down the street was still open. The glass cooler hummed as Ethan stood before it, his work boots leaving faint marks on the tile floor. Roses were stacked in neat rows, their price tags higher than a day's wages. He counted his bills twice. Then again. The woman behind the counter, noticing his hesitation and the way he carried himself, quietly gathered a bundle of lilies and baby's breath. Flowers left unsold at the end of the day. She wrapped them in plain brown paper. When Ethan fumbled for exact change, she waved away the missing coins with a gentle smile. He thanked her. The weight of the bouquet, heavier than the watch he had given up. At home. His 7-year-old daughter Lily sat cross-legged on the couch, surrounded by scraps of fabric she collected. She looked up at him, her sharp eyes immediately catching the bare spot on his wrist. "Where's Grandpa's watch?" she asked softly. Ethan knelt beside her, tucking a ribbon back into her pile. "Sometimes we let go of things so we can make room for better ones," he told her. She studied his face with the quiet seriousness only a child can have. Then she picked up a cream-colored ribbon and tied it carefully around the flowers. "Now they'll find the right heart," she said, handing them back. Across the city, in a high-rise overlooking Lake Michigan, Victoria Hayes stood in front of a closet that could have held another family's entire home. Designer gowns hung in order, each one worth more than Ethan made in months. She reached past them all, fingers settling on a plain white dress she had bought years ago in a department store when she still believed she could live separate from her last name. The dress had no label, no pedigree, just clean lines and honest fabric. Behind her, her phone buzzed with reminders about meetings, charity events, and board votes. She silenced it with a flick of her hand. Tonight she did not want to be Victoria Hayes, heiress to an empire. Tonight she wanted to step into the world as only a woman, hoping for something real. 2 lives prepared for the same evening. One had given up the only heirloom he owned to carry flowers wrapped in brown paper. The other had set aside diamonds to wear a dress no one would recognize. In the silence between them, a ribbon tied by a child waited to bridge their worlds. The coffee shop sat squeezed between a laundromat and a used bookstore, its windows fogged with steam and the faint scent of espresso drifting into the street. Ethan Miller arrived 10 minutes early, clutching the flowers wrapped in brown paper, so tightly the stems bent under his grip. He had scrubbed his hands until they were raw, but faint traces of oil still lingered beneath his nails, a reminder of who he was. He rearranged the chairs at the corner table 3 different times, moving them closer, then further apart, finally settling on something that felt safe. His leg bounced under the table, nervous energy carrying him forward and holding him back all at once. At exactly 7 o'clock, which his mind translated into 7 sharp in the evening, the door opened. Victoria Hayes stepped inside, the cool night air following her in. She wore the white dress, simple and unmarked by status, and carried herself with a quiet grace that made the mismatched furniture seem almost deliberate. Ethan shot to his feet so quickly he nearly tipped the sugar jar, fumbling with the bouquet as he thrust it forward. It was nothing more than Lily's and baby's breath tied with Lily's ribbon. But Victoria accepted it with both hands, as if he had placed a crown in her arms. She touched the ribbon softly, a flicker of something vulnerable in her eyes, and smiled in a way that surprised even herself. They began to talk, hesitant at first, then easier as the minutes passed. Ethan told her about Lily's school project on butterflies, describing how his daughter insisted that gum and tape could fix anything, even a car engine. Victoria laughed, the sound light and unfamiliar to her own ears, and shared her love for architecture, how she wandered city blocks studying buildings others barely noticed. He teased her about seeing beauty in glass and steel while he found it in rusted bolts and dented hoods. She countered that both required vision. The words came gently, layered with pauses and laughter, carrying warmth across the table. When the bill arrived, Ethan snatched it up with practiced speed. Victoria saw the pride in his shoulders as he counted each bill carefully, sliding $2 extra toward the server. To her it was a modest sum. To him it was generous. And she respected the dignity in his gesture. In the corner, a man, hunched over his phone, angled it just slightly toward them. Ethan never noticed, too busy watching Victoria's hands trace the rim of her coffee cup, too lost in the simple wonder of a woman who seemed to see him as more than a mechanic. Victoria didn't notice either, but the camera caught the way her smile lingered. The picture would not matter tonight, not while two lives leaned closer across chipped wood and warm coffee, but it waited like a shadow, a sign that this fragile beginning would soon be tested. On Saturday mornings, Ethan met Victoria at the farmer's market near the old train station. He carried Lily on his shoulders as she pointed out jars of honey and baskets of apples, while Victoria walked beside them, holding a bouquet of wildflowers that cost less than a sandwich but seemed to mean more. Ethan joked about how Lily always tried to bargain with vendors, even though she only had quarters from her allowance. Victoria laughed, noticing how Ethan turned every struggle into a story worth smiling about. At the library, during the children's reading hour, Lily sat cross-legged with a picture book in her lap. She read out loud with dramatic flair while Ethan and Victoria squeezed into small plastic chairs meant for children. Their knees bumped under the tiny table, and Victoria felt the unfamiliar comfort of belonging. Afterward, Lily tugged Victoria's hand and declared she was her guest of honor for the day. Victoria carried a paper flower Lily had folded from a library book's instructions as if it were more precious than diamonds. On quiet evenings, Ethan and Victoria walked along the river. The city lights shimmered on the water, but what stood out most was the way Ethan explained the world. He talked about fixing engines by sound alone, about working double shifts when Lily was little, and about the acceptance letter he once received from an engineering school. He had turned it down because tuition meant debt, and debt meant less for his daughter. Victoria listened, realizing this was a kind of strength she had never known. Lily skipped stones ahead of them, pausing to say her favorite line. Broken things aren't really broken. They are just waiting to become something else. Ethan ruffled her hair, and Victoria caught the truth in his eyes. That was his philosophy, born from sacrifice and resilience. She carried the words with her, not realizing yet how deeply they would cut into her own carefully built life. Victoria admired the way Ethan lived without bitterness, finding humor in hardship and dignity in small victories. She noticed how his pride showed when he paid for food truck meals in cash, or when he packed picnics from leftovers and turned them into something romantic. He gave meaning to the ordinary, and she found herself drawn into his world, piece by piece, but cracks were forming around her secret. Ethan sometimes wondered why Victoria never paid with a card, why her knowledge of architecture seemed to come from more than casual interest. She deflected with practiced ease, but the truth hovered between them like a shadow waiting to fall. For now, though, it was hidden, and what remained was the glow of quiet evenings, the laughter of a child, and the growing respect between two people who came from opposite worlds, yet somehow found a rhythm together. It was late, around 9:15 p.m., when Ethan sat in the garage break room with the television murmuring in the background. He barely listened until the anchor's voice sharpened on a familiar name. Victoria Hayes, heir to the Hayes fortune, had appeared at a charity gala the night before. The camera cut to her face, unmistakable under the diamonds and evening lights. Ethan froze, the coffee mug slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. He scrambled for his phone, typing her name into the search bar. Image after image filled the screen. Victoria stepping off yachts, standing beside senators, photographed in gowns worth more than his yearly income. Each picture drove the truth deeper. The woman who had laughed with Lily at the library was the same woman who belonged to another world entirely. By the time he stood in her penthouse the next evening, his chest felt tight with a mix of disbelief and anger. The view of the city stretched behind her, but Ethan could only see the space between them. "Was this just a game to you?" he asked. "Some kind of experiment?" Victoria shook her head, her voice trembling as she explained that she had hidden the truth out of fear. Not to deceive, she wanted to be seen as herself, not the fortune attached to her name. Ethan stared at her, the words cutting no matter how softly she said them. He thought of every moment, every laugh, every ribbon Lily had tied around those flowers, and all of it felt fragile now, like paper soaked in rain. He stepped back, his hands balled into fists, his jaw clenched against the ache in his throat. He told her he couldn't do it, couldn't live in the shadow of lies. Then he turned and walked out, leaving the echo of his footsteps in the marble hallway. Behind him, Victoria stood alone by the window, the city lights glittering against her tears. The fragile bond they had built had shattered, and both of them knew nothing would ever be the same. It happened on a blistering afternoon around 1:15 p.m. when the phone rang at the garage. Ethan was lying on his back under a Chevy, his hands slick with oil, when the secretary's urgent voice told him Lily had collapsed during recess. Panic shot through him as he rolled out and grabbed a rag, but the school was nearly 40 minutes away. His chest tightened with helplessness. He promised he was on his way, but he knew it wouldn't be fast enough. At the same moment, across town, Victoria sat in a glass-walled boardroom, the weight of executives' eyes pressing on her. Numbers flashed across screens, voices debated strategies, and her phone buzzed in her lap. She glanced at it, expecting another calendar alert, but froze when she saw the school's number. Her chair scraped loudly as she stood, ignoring the startled looks. She left mid-sentence, heels clicking across the marble lobby before she climbed into the back seat of her car. Her driver offered to weave through traffic, but she told him to stop 2 blocks short. She ran the rest of the way, breathless by the time she pushed through the school doors. In the nurse's office, Lily lay pale and disoriented, her small frame curled against the vinyl cot. Without hesitation, Victoria knelt and scooped her into her arms. Her expensive gray suit wrinkled instantly, the silk blouse stained with sweat and tears. But she didn't care. She slipped off her diamond earrings when they pressed against Lily's flushed cheek, and pulled the silk scarf from her neck to soak it in cool water, gently dabbing the girl's forehead. She rocked back and forth, humming a lullaby she barely remembered her own mother singing before the corporate world swallowed her childhood. Minutes later, Ethan burst through the door, coveralls smeared with grease, his face streaked with sweat from running the last blocks after ditching his truck in traffic. He froze when he saw them. Victoria sat in a tiny plastic chair meant for children, Lily curled against her chest, breathing more evenly now. Victoria's makeup had smeared, her perfect composure gone, and she looked up at him with tired eyes full of worry. In that moment, The doubts Ethan had carried began to dissolve. She wasn't the woman from the photos in gowns and diamonds. She was the woman who had thrown away her image to comfort his daughter. He dropped to his knees beside them, his hand brushing Lily's forehead, then hesitating before touching Victoria's cheek. "You came," he whispered, his voice cracking. "She needed someone." Victoria answered softly, "And so did you." Their eyes held for a long breath. The weight of betrayal, anger, and fear shifted, replaced by something tender and undeniable. In that cramped office, surrounded by crayons and children's drawings, the walls between their worlds finally began to fall. Ethan no longer saw an heiress. He saw the woman who had chosen his daughter without hesitation. And for the first time, he let himself believe she might belong with them. By the time summer settled in, the frenzy around Victoria's name had only grown worse. At first, the tabloids mocked the odd pairing of a billionaire heiress and a mechanic, but when they ran out of jokes, they turned cruel. Headlines splashed across front pages dragged Lily into the storm. A 7-year-old child became fodder for adults hungry for scandal. One article printed a photograph of her leaving school, twisting it into a narrative about manipulation and image. Ethan found it on his doorstep one morning, the paper circled in red marker like an accusation. His stomach turned, but his anger stayed quiet. That afternoon at 3:45 p.m., he walked into the newsroom of one of the city's biggest papers. He wore his coveralls, stained with grease, his hair uncombed after a long shift. He did not look like a man coming to fight, but like a man carrying something heavier than exhaustion. The receptionist faltered when he asked for the editor, but there was something in his steady voice that made her pick up the phone. Minutes later, Ethan stood in an office lined with awards and framed articles. The editor looked up, expecting confrontation. Instead, Ethan spoke in a voice that was low but firm. He told the man to leave his daughter out of it. "Write about me, about the garage, about the strange story of how I ended up with someone like her. But leave Lily out. She is 7 years old. She deserves a childhood, not a scandal." The room fell quiet. The editor shifted, uncomfortably aware that this was not the outburst he had expected. Ethan offered no threats, no bargaining, just a simple request anchored in love. After a long silence, the editor leaned back in his chair and sighed. He promised the story would be pulled, and Lily's name would never appear in their pages again. Ethan nodded once, thanked him, and left. Someone in the lobby filmed him as he walked out, his shoulders square, his stride steady. The clip hit the internet within hours, the caption calling him a working man who defended his family with grace. People shared it not because of drama, but because of the quiet dignity etched on his tired face. The video went viral overnight. Across town, Victoria's father sat alone in his study replaying the clip on his tablet. Henry Hayes had built an empire on steel and sharpness, yet as he watched Ethan walk through those newsroom doors without rage, he saw something he respected: determination, integrity, the kind of strength he once had when he started with nothing. Later that evening, he called Victoria. "Bring him to dinner." He said, "I was wrong about him." For Ethan, it was never about proving worth to the world. It was about protecting what mattered most. And in that quiet act of courage, the storm began to break. Not with noise, but with dignity. The wedding was small, just as they wanted. It took place in a community garden where Ethan and Victoria had once shared an early date. The air filled with the scent of flowers and the sound of neighbors gathering to celebrate. Lily ran ahead down the aisle, her daisy dress twirling as she tossed handfuls of lily petals with the delight only a child could bring. Victoria walked slowly, her hand resting on her father's arm. She wore her mother's dress, simple and altered, but still carrying the weight of memory. Henry Hayes, who had once doubted everything about Ethan, walked with surprising gentleness, his eyes softened by the family his daughter had built. Across the aisle, Ethan stood in his father's old suit, patched and tailored, but dignified, carrying pride that came not from wealth but from love. When it came time to exchange rings, there were no jewels, no gold. Victoria's was the same brass fitting Ethan had once given her on the fire escape, polished, smooth, but still unchanged. Ethan's was forged from a titanium piece salvaged from an old helicopter, strong and unpretentious. They slid the rings onto each other's hands with steady fingers, sealing a promise that had been tested and found unbreakable. After the vows, guests laughed and cried as Henry lifted his glass in a rare toast, declaring that integrity was the finest inheritance a man could leave his children. Lily sat between them at the reception, eating cake with abandon, her cheeks flushed with joy. She had been the bridge that carried them to this moment, and everyone knew it. In the months that followed, their lives settled into balance. Ethan's garage grew into something more than a repair shop. Collectors brought him classic cars and vintage motorcycles, trusting his belief that nothing broken was beyond saving. He named the business after Lily, though everyone just called it Lily's. Victoria stepped back from boardrooms and shareholders, choosing instead to lead a foundation for single parents, creating chances for others like Ethan to stand tall. On Lily's 13th birthday, Ethan placed his father's watch in her hands. Inside the case was a new engraving, words carved carefully beneath the old ones. "Every hour we choose each other is worthy." She wore it proudly, telling anyone who asked that time was the one treasure no one could buy. Years later, a morning unfolded like any other. The twins sat cross-legged on the rug while Ethan showed them how to read the watch, his calloused fingers gentle on the tiny hands of the clock. Victoria sat nearby with a stack of grant applications, her pen moving steadily as sunlight streamed through the window. Lily leaned against the table, scribbling in her journal about how broken things were never really broken. They were just waiting to become something else. The light caught the watch crystal, scattering small rainbows across the wall. It was a simple moment, ordinary to anyone else. But within it lived every sacrifice, every choice, every promise kept. Time moved forward, as it always does. But for Ethan, Victoria, and their children, every hour had become worthy.